Hi, my name is Johnny Sparks, and for this presentation, I've chosen the topic of child sexual offenders and the grooming tactics they use to choose their victims. In recent years, there has been a lot of controversy in the forensic child psychology community over the lack of a definition of the term grooming. So, for use in this presentation, I've chosen the definition proposed by Winters and Jeglick in their 2016 study. This definition says, a process by which a person prepares a child, significant adults, and the environment for the abuse of a child. Specific goals include gaining access to the child, gaining the child's compliance, and maintaining the child's secrecy to avoid disclosure. This process serves to strengthen the offender's abusive pattern, as may be used as a means of justifying or denying their actions. While this definition hits on a lot of different things, the one point I want to make is that not only do child sexual abusers groom their victims, they also groom their families and the environment, which can include anyone the child has contact with. So there are different types of offenders. The first two are intrafamilial and extrafamilial offenders. Intrafamilial offenders are those offenders that are related to the victim. Typically, they live in the same household as them. Extrafamilial offenders, on the other hand, can include anyone that knows the victim that is outside the family, and that can also include strangers. The other two types are situational and preferential offenders. So there are three different types of situational offenders. They are regressed, morally indiscriminate, and inadequate. These types of offenders molest children not because they are sexually attracted to them, but because they are there by the situation. So the first kind of situational offender is regressed. These offenders use children as a sexual substitute for their desires. They don't necessarily prefer children sexually, but they do choose them based on availability. And these type of offenders tend to have lower self-esteem and don't have as many coping skills as they need. The next type of situational offender is the morally indiscriminate. This is the classic type of child molester. These are the child molesters that lure children into the vans with promises of candy, puppies, etc. These kind of offenders typically strike outdoors. Their victims are usually strangers, and when they do have sexual contact with the victims, they typically go for the vaginal penetration. And a lot of these offenders tend to have antisocial personality disorder, which I thought was very interesting. The next, or the final type of situational offender is the inadequate. Think of this as like the Willy Wonka of child molesters or of child sexual offenders. These type of offenders are very eccentric. They're very out of social norms. And they typically choose children not because they are sexually attracted like the other ones, but they choose them because they are very non-threatening. So now we'll talk about preferential sexual offenders. So these type of offenders are sexually attracted to children. That's what separates them from the situational. And unlike the situational, which only has 3 different types, the preferential has 4: seduction, introverted, sadistic, and diverse. So the first type of preferential offender is seduction. This type of offender is going to use those grooming techniques that we'll talk about in a few. And they typically choose their victims, 1, because they are sexually attracted to them, but 2, they like to choose their victims based on their vulnerability. So most of their victims are going to be abused and neglected by their own families. The second type of preferential offender is the introverted. So these type of offenders don't have those social skills that are needed to be the seduction type. So they typically don't converse with their victims very much. So they tend to just stand afar, kind of observe their victims, and hang out where children are. So playgrounds, schools, and parks. The third type is going to be it's going to be the rarest type of offender. It's the sadistic. So these type of offenders like to inflict pain and humiliate their victims, so they get sexually aroused. And like I said, these are the rarest type of offenders, but when we do see these types, they're more likely to abduct and murder their victims in the end. And the last type of offender is going to be the diverse. These offenders are very sexually deviant, and their sexual interests are very indiscriminate. So they're willing to try anything, which makes them very sexually adventurous as well. So now that we talked about the different types of sexual offenders, we're going to talk about those grooming tactics that are most commonly used. So there's also been a lot of controversy on which grooming tactics most offenders use and the order in which they occur. So for this presentation, I've also used Jeglick and Winter's grooming tactics that they observed. So the first one is going to be victim selection. So there's many reasons why child sexual offenders will choose their victims. The main ones are going to be attractiveness of the victim, ease of access, and then the vulnerability. So typically offenders will choose children that are very vulnerable in their family. So the abused and neglected children, and the ones that are easy to access. So depending on what type of offender, you may see those children that aren't supervised by adults very often to be the ones that get striked most. And this tactic is very strategic and well planned, so it can last anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple years. The second tactic is gaining access. This one involves isolating the child from their family and friends and getting them alone. And so you can go into the third tactic, which is developing that trust. In order to get to this tactic, many child sexual offenders will get work in fields that deal with children, so school teachers, coaches, daycare workers, etc. The third tactic is trust development. This can occur simultaneously with the gaining access tactic. The main thing with this tactic is developing that trust by sharing secrets. So the offender will usually test the waters with children and see if they can keep a secret before they start moving in and start sexually touching them. And the last tactic is touch desensitization. This one is probably the scariest one because offenders start by incorporating or they start by using innocent behaviors. So they'll start with a shoulder touch, which then turns into a back rub, full body massage, and then eventually that sexual contact. And they tend to incorporate these innocent behaviors into games. So the most common is going to be the hide and seek in the dark or anything that has to do with the bed. And in this in this stage, they typically expose them to porn or erotica just to again test the waters, see how they are with that, and then they'll go further. So now we've talked about the tactics. We're going to talk about online grooming. This is something that has been coming more into play in recent years as technology advances. So it started with chat rooms, but now we see it's moved to social media websites such as Facebook. It was MySpace, Tumblr, and now even Snapchat. So we see in a study by Winters, Kahlers, and Jeglick, where they really looked into sex offenders and how they contact children via online grooming. And they found that offenders alter their techniques and tactics based on the gender of their victim. So, for example, when offenders try to contact boys, they typically lower their age to around the same age as the victim just to get them more comfortable. Whereas if they were trying to contact girl victims, they would keep their age the same. So online grooming typically happens at a faster pace. Usually within a couple days, they start trying to test the waters with that sexual those sexual topics, and then they all usually try to meet up in person for that sexual contact. So there's only two stages. The first one is browsing chat rooms, and then the second one is communicating with victims. So in order to combat this, there are a lot of things that we have to figure out first. The first one is stranger danger. Um, Everyone knows about this, but we're going to go into it a little bit more. And then a lot of schools have proposed school-based prevention programs to really educate and allow students to identify those grooming tactics and that sexual behavior that they can watch out for. So stranger danger, that really incorporates a thing called the hindsight bias. So the hindsight bias is the I knew it all along phenomenon. Typically, this is seen with intrafamilial offenses. So a little backstory on stranger danger. This really came about in the 1980s and 1990s. It really wanted to focus on making kids watch out for those very rare extrafamilial offenders, the strangers, the ones that typically lure the children into the cars with promises of candy and puppies. So they taught children how to say or how to watch out for those offenders and told them only go with trusted adults, don't do anything that would get you kidnapped. So whenever kids were molested by intrafamilial offenders, they would have this guilt and shame, and this guilt and shame would carry on to the family because the family didn't know that they were being molested or they were being sexually abused. So a lot of people were thinking, well, how could you not see that? So that's where this hindsight bias comes in. So the hindsight bias really shows up when um, outside people would accuse the family or they would shame the family for not knowing, when in reality, based on Winners and Jeglick's 2016, I knew it all along um, study, most people would not notice those grooming tactics when they're used. And so in my research, I looked at a lot of different school-based prevention programs that really focus in on getting children to identify and be able to say no to these advances. And from what I found, the best study I found was Oldfield, Hayes, and Meagle in their 1996 study. Kind of a little older, but one of the first pioneers for this. And they put together a list of topics or characteristics that successful programs have. So we can incorporate these into more school-based prevention programs and deal with that issue further. So recognizing sexual touch, good touch, bad touch, good secrets, bad secrets, how to confide in trusted adults, as well as who to trust, saying no to unwanted advances, and then how to report that abuse. And all that goes back into um, educating the mandated reporters into knowing how and when these tactics will occur. So I know that presentation was a little lengthy, but this is a very important problem in America and all over the world right now. As technology advances, we're going to see a lot more online grooming, and it's going to evolve into a problem that's going to be harder to detect. Thank you.